Okay, thanks very much. So my name is Simon Neill. I'm from the Ocean Physics Group in the School of Ocean Sciences, Bangor University. There's three of us at the meeting, and we're all speaking today. So just to acknowledge some sources of funding. So this is primarily an EPSRC SeaGen project. We've also got funding from LCRI within Wales, the Low Carbon Research Institute, and all our supercomputing is being performed on a project called HPC Wales, High Performance Computing Wales, which is in partnership with Fujitsu. Okay, so this piece of work is on Orkney. I think most people here will be familiar with Orkney, so we'll go very quickly when it comes to introducing Orkney. So this is the outline of the presentation. So I'm looking at tidal asymmetry, so I'll present a little bit of theory first of all, then introduce the case study of Orkney, and perform some three-dimensional modelling, again using this model system called ROMS. And look at some outputs and discuss various things such as how it fits with the theory that I've introduced here, and also practical resource and consideration of different hub heights above the bed. Okay, so I think most people will be familiar with the M2, the principal lunar semidiurnal constituent. Okay, so it's just the twice daily movement of the tides. So the period of it's 12.42 hours, so that's the period showing along this timeline here. Okay, so that's a tidal cycle. And it's quite easy to model the tides in the deep ocean because everything's very linear. But once you get onto the shelf seas and into very shallow water, there's a lot of non-linear effects. And what we're particularly interested in is the generation of overtides. So these are the harmonics that are generated from these principal constituents. So the example shown here is the M4 constituent. That's the first harmonic of the M2. And it's the sort of thing that's responsible for getting phenomena like double high waters that you get in the English Channel. Okay, so it can, and it's also responsible for asymmetry, as I'll show in the next slide. So if you have this, so this is the flood and the ebb phase of the tide. That's the M2 constituent. That's its first harmonic, the M4. Okay, so the M4 will have a lower amplitude than the M2. Okay, because it's still the major source of power. If you then combine these in such a way to, if you add them, so the solid line is just the M2 and the M4 added, that shows the current speed over the tidal cycle. So you can see even though you've got a distorted tide, you've still got a symmetrical tide, so you've got symmetry between the flood and the ebb phase of the tidal cycle. Also, if you cube the velocity, then you've got something which is a proxy for power. So you can see that any effect in asymmetry will be amplified once you cube it. Okay, but again, the power between the flood and the ebb is symmetrical for this case. Okay, and that's just a case where the phase relationship between the M2 and the M4 is as shown in this top figure. However, in the next slide, you see I've altered this phase relationship. So for example, the M2 and the M4 are in phase here, and you get a very strong signal during the flood phase of the tide, and they're out of phase during the ebb, and so we get a much weaker but prolonged period of ebb. Okay, so this is asymmetry just from changing the phase relationship between this M2 and M4. Okay, and again, the asymmetry is amplified if you cube the velocity, and so consider power. So you can see huge asymmetry between the flood and the ebb phase of the tide. Okay, and it turns out that if you do some quite simple mathematics, you can look at the phase relationship between the M2 and the M4, and that's plotted along the x-axis here. And here you can calculate the asymmetry. So is there a legend of some sort. Oh, here it is. Okay, so the black line is the velocity, and units here are fairly arbitrary, so I've just cubed the velocity just to show that it's a bigger effect when you're considering power. Okay, and you can see that there's symmetry when this phase relationship is 90 degrees or 270 degrees, and there's maximum asymmetry when this phase relationship is 0 degrees or 180 degrees. Okay, so you can either have flood dominance or ebb dominance based on this phase relationship. And of course it just repeats. This is 360 degrees, it just repeats. Okay, so that's very interesting and theoretical, but we wanted to look at a real case study. So we tend to model at large scale, UK shelf scale, or the Irish Sea scale. But of course, once you're working with marine renewables, it's very hard not to be tempted to, or drawn towards simulating the Pentland Firth or Orkney. Okay, so we thought we'd use Orkney as a case study, and I don't think I need to introduce this. Yellows are wave sites, and pinks are proposed or existing tidal sites, such as the EMEC test centre. Okay, so again, I've been using this ROMS model, and it's part of a larger package that we implement called COAST. And the whole system is coupled through this model coupling toolkit, MCT, an acronym that's familiar to some people for other purposes. So we do fully couple these and implement the sediment transport model. But today I'm just going to be focusing on the ROMS model. Okay, the WRF, by the way, is the atmospheric model. It's a sort of downscaling atmospheric model to get very high resolution wind input when topographic effects and other processes are important. Okay, so I'm just focusing on the ROMS model. And to set the model up, I run an outer model first. So the outer model it's all in spherical coordinates, but it relates to about 500 meters resolution, the outer model, and that's directly forced with this FES 2012, which not many people use FES 2012. It's an altimetry product. Most people tend to use TPXO, but FES is a fairly new product, and it's quite sophisticated. It's a 16th of a degree resolution globally, and there are 32 constituents. Actually, I thought it was 33, but I think there's a large number of constituents anyway, and certainly the ones that we're interested in. Then nested within this was a high resolution model of Orkney, which is about 75 meter resolution. For those who are interested, we used the K-epsilon turbulence model. It's a three-dimensional model, so we're interested in this study and how the asymmetry varies with height above the bed. But for our purposes, we just use 10 vertical sigma layers, so the terrain following layers. You would probably use a lot more for a fully 3D simulation where you're interested in the baroclinic flow, but we're just interested in the barotropic tide. Okay, and as I mentioned, I think I only used the M2 and the S2 tidal constituents. So it's not a full resource study, we're just interested in the asymmetry. Okay, so this is the co-tidal charts produced from the analysis of the outer model. So the color scale is the amplitude, the one on the left is the M2, the one on the right is the S2. Got my 5-minute warning already. I'm in trouble, I think. So I'll not describe this any further, but just to show you that this is the region of the inner nested model, and these are some results from it. The color scale shows the peak tidal currents at spring at the actual resolution, whereas the vectors are just every third or every fifth grid cell. Okay, and this gives us, to first order, a sense of the tidal asymmetry. So this is the EMEC test site. I think it may come up with a circle, yeah. So it's the EMEC test site. This is Westray Firth and Stronsay Firth. Okay, and you can see it's more or less a bedload parting zone, this, so there's a zone of divergence, and we have flood dominance on this side of the EMEC test site, and it's very complicated to the northwest. but generally we have ebb dominance at this side. Okay, so we went through some criteria. So we chose spring currents which are greater than 2 meters a second and water depths in the range 25 to 50 meters. So the sort of conditions that would be suitable for first generation tidal energy devices. And very conveniently produces this region. It's about 70 square kilometers aligned right through the EMEC test site. Okay, and I've selected 21 sites along this channel. By the way, there's another site that comes up in Firth of Lashy, I think it's called, or Lashy Sound, which is, I can't exactly remember where it is, but I think there's a poster on that topic. Okay, so this is just a graphic showing the 2 or 3 contrasting sites. So we've got ebb dominance at this site, symmetry at this site, the center one, and flood dominance at this site. So the 2 extremes at each end of the test channel. Okay, and this is just the time series of the depth average tidal current, and it just shows in some detail the asymmetry over time. Okay, but we were interested in our theoretical curve. So if I consider first of all the horizontal tide, it's actually quite messy and it wasn't as nice as I expected it to be. But it does generally fit the theory in that we've generally got the sign right, and it has positives and negatives. So what I've done is I've produced a metric for asymmetry. So it's just the flood velocity divided by the ebb velocity, I think, at peak. And this is just the phase relationship. So that's based on theory for this blue curve and tidal analysis at each of these 21 sites for the points. I've also included error bars produced by the tidal analysis. Quite large errors in some cases. Okay, so it's quite a scattering of data. But if you look at the vertical tide, you get a much nicer fit. So it shouldn't strictly fit to the theory, but it does produce a very, very nice, pleasing result. And that's because if you just move a small amount spatially, you get a completely different, sometimes the tidal currents change very rapidly, whereas the tidal elevations are very smoothly varying as you move spatially. So that's why the result is so sensitive to the horizontal tides in comparison to the vertical tide. Okay, so for that reason we get a much nicer result when we look at the vertical tide. Okay, so I've just got a couple more things to look at. So the first one is to look at a more practical resource, and that's generated by implementing the power curve for the SeaGen device. So the power curves that are publicly available from the Strangford Narrows deployment. And we've again chosen these 3 sites, so the 3 sort of contrasting sites. And there's a few things of interest in this, but the main one I'll focus on here is the asymmetry in the power. So it's a huge asymmetry in the practical resource. So particularly if you consider the cut-in speed for the device, you can see that some cases it's generating on the flood only, for example here, and there's no generation on the ebb, or minimal generation on the ebb, and that's depending on this threshold, the cut-in speed. Okay, and something else we looked at was influence of, or how tidal asymmetry varied with height above the water column. So I'll not go into that in much detail other to say that there's more asymmetry higher in the water column. And also this plot makes it slightly clearer that something like a 30% change, this is now in percentage terms, a 30% change in the velocity asymmetry translates into about 100% asymmetry in power. Okay, so a smallish or a moderate asymmetry in velocity translates into a huge asymmetry in power. Okay, you'll be glad to hear that I'm on the conclusions. So that's what I said, the first point. So 30% velocity asymmetry leads to 100% power asymmetry. And we fit our theory reasonably well for an actual case study. And there's stronger asymmetry higher in the water column. There's something else which I didn't, luckily I didn't include the slide, which is this one, but you can see that in this paper. And in the paper, it says here, stuff in the paper, there's other 3D variables output, such as turbulent kinetic energy. And this again is very sensitive to asymmetry. And I've also looked at the impact of wind-driven currents, which do have an effect, but not as big an effect as we would have hoped for, I think. Okay, and other stuff we're working on, so some of it was presented, is wave-current interaction. So we're looking at wave-current interaction around Orkney, and we have a 10-year wave model for the region now at the same resolution that I've shown here. Sediment dynamics, so this is our sort of bread and butter research, is looking at sediment dynamics and changes to offshore sandbanks. And if anybody spotted, we had a Renegade poster. It wasn't on the program, but I had a spare poster with me and I put it up in one of the spare poster slots. And this is to do with the transport of shellfish larvae around Orkney and how that would be affected, how the connectivity would be affected by the introduction of marine renewable energy structures. Okay, so that's me. Thank you.